When Chuck Berry walked into a Chicago blues club in 1954 carrying an electric guitar, the greatest blues musicians alive laughed at him. "That's not a real guitar," they said. Muddy Waters refused to even touch it. 30 minutes later, every single one of them was begging Chuck to let them try it. What happened in those 30 minutes changed music history forever. It was a Thursday night in August 1954 at a small club on Chicago's South Side called the Blue Note. The place wasn't fancy. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, the floorboards creaked, and the bar served whiskey that tasted like regret. But on Thursday nights, the Blue Note became sacred ground for blues musicians. This was where legends came to play after their official gigs, where Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, and Little Walter would show up around midnight and jam until the sun came up. No audience, no money, just the purest form of blues you could find anywhere in America. Chuck Berry had been playing clubs around St. Louis, but he'd recently moved to Chicago with a dream. He wanted to make it as a blues musician, and if you wanted to make it in the blues, you had to earn the respect of the Thursday night crew at the Blue Note. But Chuck was bringing something with him that no serious blues musician would be caught dead using. A brand new Gibson ES 350T electric guitar, cherry red, shiny, expensive, and in the eyes of traditional blues musicians, completely ridiculous. When Chuck walked through that door carrying his guitar case, the room went quiet. Muddy Waters was sitting at the bar, nursing a drink. Howlin' Wolf was in the corner, smoking a cigar. Willie Dixon was tuning his upright bass. "Who's this?" Muddy asked, eyeing the young newcomer. "Chuck Berry," Chuck said, extending his hand. "From St. Louis. Heard this was the place to play some real blues." Muddy shook his hand, nodded. "What you got in the case?" Chuck opened it. The electric guitar gleamed under the dim lights. The reaction was immediate. Howlin' Wolf actually laughed out loud. Willie Dixon shook his head. Little Walter, who'd been quiet up until then, spoke up. "Man, did you take a wrong turn? Rock and roll practice is across town." "This is a blues guitar," Chuck said, trying to stay confident despite the hostile room. "That's not a real guitar," Muddy said flatly. "That's a toy. You plug that thing into a wall?" "Yeah, into an amplifier," Chuck explained. "Son," Howlin' Wolf said, standing up to his full 6'6" height, "real blues comes from here." He tapped his chest. "Not from electricity. Any fool can make noise if you give him enough voltage. But blues requires soul." Chuck felt his face getting hot. These were his heroes, and they were dismissing him like he was some kid with a gimmick. "I got soul," Chuck said quietly. "Just because I use an amp doesn't mean I don't have soul." "Prove it," Muddy said. "But use a real guitar, Willie. Let him borrow your acoustic." "No," Chuck said, surprising even himself. "I'll prove it with this one." The room went dead silent. You didn't challenge Muddy Waters, not in his club, not on his night. Muddy stared at Chuck for a long moment. Then he smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "All right, kid. You got 30 minutes. You make us believe that electric thing is a real instrument. We'll let you stay. You fail. You leave. And you don't come back. Deal?" Chuck swallowed hard. "Deal." He pulled out his guitar, found an outlet, and plugged in his small amplifier. The other musicians watched with barely concealed amusement. To them, this was going to be entertainment, just not the kind Chuck was hoping for. Chuck sat down on a stool, adjusted his amp settings, and looked up at the legend staring at him. His hands were shaking. Everything he'd worked for came down to this moment. He started with a traditional blues progression, 12-bar blues, simple and clean. But something was different. The electric guitar had a warmth that acoustic didn't have, a sustain. The notes hung in the air like smoke. The musicians' smiles faded a bit. They were listening now. Chuck moved into the second verse, and he started doing something unusual. He was bending the strings, creating sounds that you couldn't make on an acoustic guitar, sliding notes that cried and wailed. The electricity wasn't making the guitar louder, it was making it more expressive. Howlin' Wolf leaned forward, interested despite himself. Then Chuck did something nobody expected. He turned up his amp, way up, and he played a riff that hit the room like a physical force. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling. It was raw. It was powerful. It was everything blues was supposed to be, but amplified, intensified, impossible to ignore. The guitar didn't sound like background music anymore. It sounded like a voice, like it was telling a story all by itself, without words, without apology. Chuck's fingers flew across the fretboard. He wasn't just playing blues, he was transforming it, taking everything traditional about the genre and pushing it somewhere new, somewhere electric, somewhere dangerous. The other musicians had stopped smiling entirely. They were just listening, watching, trying to figure out what they were hearing. After about 10 minutes, Chuck shifted into a faster rhythm. His right hand was a blur, picking notes so quickly they almost blended together, and the sound that came out, that wasn't anything anyone in that room had heard before. It was blues, yes, but it was something else too. Something that didn't have a name yet. It was rock and roll. When Chuck finally stopped playing, his fingers were sore and his shirt was soaked with sweat. The room was completely silent. Muddy Waters sat his drink down slowly. He walked over to where Chuck was sitting. For a terrifying moment, Chuck thought Muddy was going to tell him to leave. Instead, Muddy pointed at the guitar. "Let me try that thing." Chuck handed it over, showed him how to hold it. Where the volume controls were, Muddy Waters, the father of Chicago blues, the man who influenced everyone from the Rolling Stones to Led Zeppelin, strapped on an electric guitar for the first time in his life. He played one chord, just one, and his eyes went wide. "Lord have mercy," Muddy whispered. "What is this?" He played another chord, then another. His hands, which had played acoustic guitar for 30 years, were discovering something entirely new, the way the notes sustained, the way you could control the tone, the way a single note could fill an entire room. "I can feel it in my chest," Muddy said, almost to himself. "Every note, I can feel it." Willie Dixon stood up. "My turn." One by one, every musician in that room tried Chuck's electric guitar. Howlin' Wolf, who'd called it a toy, played it for 15 minutes straight and didn't want to give it back. Little Walter, who played harmonica, tried it and immediately started thinking about how harp and electric guitar could work together. What Chuck had done wasn't just play well, he'd shown them that the electric guitar wasn't a betrayal of blues. It was an evolution. It was taking everything the blues had always been, all that pain and soul and storytelling, and giving it more power, making it louder, making it impossible to ignore. Around 2 a.m., Muddy Waters pulled Chuck aside. "Where'd you buy that guitar?" "Gibson shop, on State Street," Chuck said. Muddy nodded slowly. "How much?" $350. Muddy whistled. That was serious money. In 1954, more than most musicians made in 2 months. But he was already doing the math in his head, figuring out how he could afford one. "Kid," Muddy said, "I owe you an apology. When you walked in here, I thought you were trying to cheat." Thought you were using electricity to cover up not having talent. But you showed me something tonight. You showed me the future. I just played what I felt, Chuck said. No, Muddy said. You did more than that. You showed us old dogs that we've been thinking too small. We've been so worried about keeping blues pure that we forgot blues has always been about evolution, about taking pain and turning it into something powerful. That electric guitar, it don't make the blues less real, it makes it more real. Louder, stronger. By the time Chuck left the Blue Note that night, everything had changed. The same musicians who'd laughed at him were now asking questions. Where could they buy electric guitars? What kind of amps did he recommend? How did you get that bending sound? Within a month, Muddy Waters had purchased his own electric guitar. Within 6 months, he'd recorded I'm Your Hoochie Coochie Man with a full electric band. That song became one of the biggest blues hits of all time and established electric guitar as the dominant sound in blues music. Howlin' Wolf went electric shortly after. Willie Dixon started writing songs specifically for electric guitar. Little Walter figured out how to mic his harmonica so it could compete with the new electric sound. And Chuck Berry, he took what he'd learned from the blues and pushed it even further. He created a style of electric guitar playing that became the foundation of rock and roll. Those riffs, those solos, that raw energy, it all came from that night when he had to prove to his heroes that electricity and soul could coexist. The irony is that the British musicians who later fell in love with the blues, kids like Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, and Jeff Beck, they learned to play by listening to Muddy Waters' electric recordings. They didn't even know that Muddy had started out playing acoustic. To them, blues was electric from the beginning. But it wasn't. There was a moment, one specific night in Chicago in 1954, when blues made the jump from acoustic to electric. When the old guard decided maybe the new guard was onto something. In 1987, shortly before he died, Muddy Waters gave an interview where he talked about that night. I was stubborn, he admitted. Thought I knew everything about the blues. Then this young cat from St. Louis showed me I didn't know nothing. He showed me that a guitar ain't just wood and strings. It's whatever you need it to be. And sometimes, what you need is electricity. That electric guitar Chuck brought to the Blue Note now sits in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There's a placard next to it that reads, "The guitar that changed blues forever." But what really changed wasn't the guitar. It was the minds of the men who'd refused to touch it. The legends who thought they knew everything about music until a young upstart showed them they'd been thinking too small. Chuck Berry didn't just play guitar that night. He opened a door that every rock guitarist since has walked through. From Jimi Hendrix to Eddie Van Halen to modern players, they're all using the instrument that blues legends once called a toy. And it all started because Chuck Berry was brave enough to walk into a room full of his heroes and say, "This is real, let me show you." 30 minutes. That's all it took to change music history. 30 minutes of one young musician refusing to back down, refusing to compromise, refusing to believe that tradition and innovation can't coexist. The next time someone tells you that real artists don't need technology, remember that night at the Blue Note. Remember that even legends can be wrong. And remember that sometimes progress looks like betrayal until you actually hear it. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button, share it with someone who needs to hear that being different isn't the same as being wrong. Drop a comment telling us about a time when you had to prove yourself to people who doubted you. And ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that changed music forever.